Okay, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Alex. I'm a member of the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Planning Committee, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation of Nature's Best Hope with renowned environmentalist and New York Times best-selling author Doug Tallamy. The pollinator pathway is helping to create essential habitat in our community for our vital and vulnerable pollinator population. And it's a collaborative project of the Woodstock Land Conservancy, the Catskill Center, Woodstock New York Transitions, the Woodstock Environmental Commission, and members of our community. You can join the pathway, check out upcoming events and previously recorded presentations on our website at woodstocknypollinatorpathway.org. And so after this evening's presentation, there's going to be a Q&A. So at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little Q&A box. And if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to type something in there, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it. So Doug Tallamy is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored over 100 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is an understanding of the many ways insect and plant interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. He's the author of Bringing Nature Home: How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, published in 2007, The Living Landscape, published in 2014, and his newest book, Nature's Best Hope, released in February of this year, is a New York Times bestseller. And he's also the recipient of a number of prestigious conservation and writing awards. And you know, as we face headlines about global insect and bird decline, we must recognize how ineffective our current landscape designs have been at sustaining the plants and animals that sustain our own lives here on Earth. And if we wish to avoid catastrophic loss, we must urgently combat and reverse this decline in biodiversity. Mr. Tallamy is going to discuss simple steps that each of us can and must take, and will explain why we ourselves are nature's best hope. And before I turn it over to Doug, the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Committee Chair, Georgia Asher, has a couple words to say to everybody. So Georgia?
Hi. So if you live anywhere near Woodstock, New York, you can join the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. It's very easy. All you have to do is create some pollinator habitat in your yard, and then go to our website and sign up to join the pathway. And another thing you can do is you can buy one of these signs that is a metal sign for your yard to show that you're part of the pollinator pathway. It says this property is on the pollinator pathway, native plants, pesticide free. So and you should try to get your neighbors to join too, because the whole idea is to create some connectivity of habitat. In other words, pathways or corridors for insects. This is very important. So to get this sign and to join the pollinator pathway, go to our website at woodstocknypollinatorpathway.org. I'll say that again, woodstocknypollinatorpathway.org. Okay, and I hope you will enjoy this wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Am I on? Okay, thank you, Georgia. Thank you, Alex. It's an honor to be the opening act for the Kamala Mike show tonight. So I'll make sure I'm done by 9 o'clock. I want to talk to you about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want you to think back to last fall. I know that at our house, all the oaks got together and decided they would make, all the red oaks got together and decided they'd make their acorns at the same time. And I believe it happened at least from New York all the way down to Georgia. It's called an oak mast, and this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, if you're easily entertained like I am, maybe you took one of those acorns and just stared at it. And if you stared long enough, maybe you saw this happen. An insect is actually chewing its way out of that acorn. And it chews, it doesn't take long, starts to squeeze its way through the little hole, kind of looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy, finally flops on the ground. Well, this is a really dangerous time for this insect larva because it tastes really good. It is full of protein, full of fat, lots of things want to eat it. So it's got to get to a safe place right away, and it does. It squiggles and squirms and works its way below the soil surface in about 30 seconds, where it stretches in all different directions and forms a little chamber and then converts itself into a pupa, and it stays there for 2 years. And after 2 years, it comes out as an acorn weevil. This is what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. And females use those mouth parts to chew a hole down into the center of that acorn. They turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Now you might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year? And that's because red oak acorns take 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, the crop of acorns would be too small for the big population of acorn weevils. Well, when they leave the acorn, that of course leaves a hole, a true vacuum, and you know nature abhors a vacuum. So there are actually 3 species of temnothorax ants that specialize in living inside the vacated holes of that made by acorn weevils in acorns. That's where their house is, in the acorn. So when they find a brand new hole, they're excited. Their old acorn's falling apart. They've got to find a new one. So they tell everybody, they get together and they start to move the colony in, and they work hard. Everybody's at it. It only takes about 30 minutes. And when they're finally in, they post a guard here at the entrance, and there's this little antennae. Make sure no uninvited guests get in there. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What is your point? What are you trying to tell us?" What I'm trying to tell you is that is just one of literally millions of specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. Here's another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Actually, all over the world, different species of jays are the major dispersers of acorns. Here's another one. You won't have pileated woodpeckers breeding in your yard unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that is what they feed their young. And of course, you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Phacelia. That is the only plant that bee can rear its young on, the only pollen that it can rear its young on, very specialized. As a matter of fact, out of the 4,000 species of native bees we have, about a third of them are specialized on one particular type of pollen. So in your area in New York, there are about 13 species of native bees that will only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. Just as an example, Baltimore checker spot is only going to be on white turtlehead. I could spend all night long talking about specialized relationships. But today, these types of relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we didn't take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the creation of the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem, of course, is that that's no longer an option over most of the country. There's only about 5% of the country that's anywhere close to its original pristine state. So leaving it as it is isn't going to work. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in the US. We've paved it, of course, and otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers and introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are now running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self, each of which are too small and too isolated from each other to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all rely on. Why have we done this? Well, we had this idea that the Earth was so big, our nest was so big, we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. And that did work for a long time, but certainly there are consequences. Now we have so many people on the planet, and that's why we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Followed by this one, North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That is a third of the North American bird population gone. As a matter of fact, the UN now predicts that we will, that 1 million species on planet Earth will go extinct possibly in the next 20 years. And you know, it's funny, they report things like this. You read headlines like this as if it's just another headline. They might as well have said, oxygen is going to disappear in the next 20 years, because losing 1 million species is not an option, folks. It is simply not an option. Well, I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and thus upon all of our houses, but it's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small actions from a lot of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson, professor emeritus at this point from Harvard, told us what it would mean if we were to lose our insects. And he did it way back in 1987 in this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. He's talking about the importance and conservation of invertebrates, but he's really talking about insects. If we were to lose our insects, life as we know it would change drastically, because life as we know it depends on insects. If insects were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants, which would drastically alter energy flow through terrestrial habitats. It's the energy flow that is what forms the food webs that supports our animals, transferring energy from plants to animals. Well, that'd be interrupted and the animals would disappear. No more amphibians, reptiles, birds, or mammals. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot, because we would have lost the insect decomposers that, as of now, rapidly turn over nutrients. All we'd have is bacteria and fungus. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that doesn't have to happen. We can save our insects. As a matter of fact, we must save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do that. Why is that? Well, let me just remind you, humans are a product of nature. We're not separate from it. We're a product of it. We are totally dependent on it. So we can't afford to lose it. Nature, functioning ecosystems, deliver what we call ecosystem services. What do we get from plants? Well, here are just a few things we get from plants. How about oxygen? Pretty important. Plants clean water, slow its journey to the sea where it's too salty to use. Here's a really important one. Today, they capture carbon. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air, build their tissues out of that carbon, and pump the excess carbon into the ground. The soil around us is brown or black because of carbon that plants have deposited there over the ages. They build topsoil, hold it in place. If we didn't have any plants, there'd be no topsoil on the planet. It would all be in the ocean. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate about 90% of our flowering plants, disperse plant seeds, and many other things. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is simply not an option. Today, it never was a good option, but today it is not an option at all. We've got what, 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet. We need more ecosystem services now than ever before, not fewer. Well, there were visionaries through the ages that recognized we did not have a very healthy relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent in the early 1900s. He was a prolific writer. And one of the things he said was, the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been some indigenous groups that have been pretty good at that, but our European culture and even the Asian culture is not good at all at living on the land without spoiling it. We are really good at spoiling it, moving to another place and spoiling it. Of course, there are no more places now that are relatively unspoiled. So Aldo had this dream that we humans would develop what he called a land ethic. We needed to use the earth. He got that. We needed to farm it and lumber it and graze on it and mine it and hunt and do all those other things. But we had to learn how to do those things gently. We had to learn to do those things without destroying local ecosystem function. And that would be the land ethic that he was talking about. And he developed this idea in his famous Sand County Almanac. It's curious to me that he never wrote about developing a land ethic where we actually lived. It was always someplace else where we were using the earth. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo's day, and it's certainly embedded in our own, that he didn't see it as an option, didn't recognize it as an option. I'm going to argue tonight, though, that living with nature not only is an option, I think it's the only viable option that's left to us. Now, in the past, conservationists, of course, worked where there were very few people because they wanted to conserve what people hadn't ruined yet. We've got to turn that on its head now. We have to save nature, restore nature where there are a lot of people, because that's most of the earth at this point. So we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Where should we start? Well, let's go back to this place, private property. You know, 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignored private property, if we didn't do any conservation on it, like this guy's not doing, we would definitely lose, because then we'd only be doing conservation on at most 15% of the land, and that is not enough. That's what creates those tiny little habitat fragments that are too small to sustain the nature we need them to sustain. But forget private or public property. There are lots of areas that we just don't think of as potential sites for conservation. How about power and pipeline rights-of-ways? We've got 21 million acres in those types of rights-of-ways. Railroad rights-of-ways, roadside rights-of-ways, 17 million acres of roadsides. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. You know, the Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are big areas. And then we have all the places where we live, from rural areas right to urban centers, hundreds of millions of acres on those sites. So just these areas, you can think of others, but just these add up to 599 million acres that could be centers for conservation if we made them that way. How big is 599 million acres? That's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, plus Virginia, plus New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, even Texas combined. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We got lots of places we can do conservation. What do I mean when I say conservation? I actually don't mean conservation. I mean restoration. And I don't even mean restoration. People say, oh, you can't put it back exactly the way it was. I know that. You can't put it back exactly the way it was, but we can restore functional interactions in between species and natural systems that create ecosystem function, that produce ecosystem services. It won't be exactly the way it was 500 years ago, but that's okay. That's okay. It can still function in a natural way. So how are we going to do that? We need to start with the species that contribute the most to ecosystem function. Not all species contribute equally. So we have to start with those building block species, the ones that other species depend on. And you're not going to have any kind of an ecosystem unless you have a functional food web in that ecosystem. What's a food web? Well, you know, the plants are capturing the energy from the sun and turning it into food. That energy then has to get out to all the animals. If it stays locked up in the plant, you don't have a functional food web. Well, most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and that something is typically insects. And out of the insects that eat plants, it turns out caterpillars are the most important in terms of transferring energy to other animals. All over the world, caterpillars transfer more energy from plants than any other type of plant eater. So if we got rid of our caterpillars, which we are doing, you're going to leave an awful lot of energy locked up in plants, and your food webs will collapse. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. And you've got black-capped chickadee up where you are, doing exactly the same thing. They're at our feeders right now, eating seeds, and people say, well, that's what they need. That's half of what they need in the wintertime. But when they're reproducing, a really important part in their life history, they need insects. Their babies cannot eat seeds, so they switch to insects. And when they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they're not exceptions. 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects. And again, most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, My grad student, Ashley Kennedy, recently finished the citizen science project, and some of you may have contributed to it, where she asked people from all over the country to take pictures of birds as they were bringing food to the nest and send those pictures to her. And then she would identify what's in the beak and then construct what the nestling diet looked like. So you're looking at the nestling diet for 20 families of birds, and the green bars represent the percentage of those diets that are caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 families, caterpillars dominate the diet. So again, what would happen if we took caterpillars out of our landscapes? Most of these birds would be unable to breed. Well, it sure looks like something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things that are special about caterpillars compared to other types of insects. One of the most obvious is that they are soft. Think of this guy as a sausage, a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. That thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, it's undigestible. So the birds don't want a lot of that. And then it surrounds a lot of good food, a lot of fat, a lot of protein. And because caterpillars are soft, you can stuff them down the throat of your babies without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. They take that beak, it's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our small birds do chase aphids around, particularly during fall migration. They're doing it right now. But do you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar? They're nutritious, as I said, a lot of protein in there, a lot of very important fats. They're low in chitin compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. A lot of undigestible material there, and they also have a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I talk about carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates can't make their own carotenoids. They have to get them from plants. Only plants make carotenoids. Yet, carotenoids are essential parts of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife, Cindy, makes sure I have my carrots to get my beta carotene and my tomatoes to get my lycopene, my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure I eat all of those things because they stimulate my immune system. And I can't think of a better time to have a very strong immune system. Carotenoids are antioxidants. They protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about male birds like the Sperthonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he has had access to lots of luteins. He takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids? They're getting them from what they eat, but carotenoids are not equally distributed among bird prey items. The first two bars here are caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of prey. The third bar are orthopteroids, things like grasshoppers and crickets and katydids. Way down here, we have adult caterpillars, the moths and the butterflies themselves. They don't have a lot of carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. It's the caterpillars that eat the green leaves. And then way over here is the earthworm. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this influence prey choice when birds are feeding their young? Well, Ashley did another study where she put GoPro cameras on the rooftops of bluebird houses. And she had a lot of GoPro cameras and a lot of bluebird houses, and she did it for 3 years. And those cameras took a picture once every second. So she ended up with more than 1 million pictures she had to go through. The object was to get a good picture of the birds every time they flew into the box with a prey item. And most of the time they would land on the roof of the box and pose, and it was easy to do that. So she ended up with 7,628 pictures that were good enough that she could identify the prey item in the beak. And it turned out that the prey items taken most often were caterpillars, and they had the highest level of carotenoids. And the second most frequent prey items were those orthopteroids, and they had the second highest. And then everybody else is nestled down here. So there's certainly a good correlation between carotenoid content and how often the birds chose those prey items. All of this suggests that caterpillars may not be optional parts of bird diets. It's really starting to look like they are essential parts of bird diets. So let's say that they are, and birds need caterpillars. How many do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Well, again, let's go to chickadees. A lot of data on chickadee reproduction. No, 1 or 2 is not enough. They need thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear 1 clutch of chickadees. And that's to get them to the point where they fledge. After they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days, but they're flying all over the place, so nobody's counted those. So you're talking about many, many, many thousands of caterpillars to rear a bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want that bird to breed in your yard, and we do want those birds to breed in our yards, because there's not many places that aren't our yards these days, you've got to have that many caterpillars within 50 meters of the nest. Most birds are not foraging very far from the nest because there's so many trips each day, they can't do that much flying without using more energy than they get. So for chickadees, about 50 meters from the nest, you got to have 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. And when we don't landscape in a way that creates that many caterpillars, then you don't have the caterpillars, you get insect declines, but that seems to be tied to bird declines. The study, Rosenberg et al., that in Science last year that said we've lost 3 billion birds, they posted their data online and we took a look at it. And the bird species that are losing population numbers, it's not equally distributed among North American birds. We separated them into 2 groups: the birds that require insects at one part of their life history, typically when they are breeding, and the birds that do not require insects, the doves and the finches that can rear their young on a little milky substance that they actually make out of the seeds. They actually gained a couple million individuals per species, but the species that require insects lost on average about 10 million individuals per species. So again, doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly suggests there's a strong relation. When you build landscapes from which insects have disappeared, the birds that need those insects are in trouble. So how do we make landscapes that create a lot of caterpillars? Well, that's actually pretty easy. You add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make them. That makes sense. There is a catch, though, and that is most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. And very quickly, you can look at this data set. This is from the Southwest, but all of them in the country look the same. This is plant genera on the x-axis here. In the Southwest, there's 1,531 plant genera, and this is the number of species of caterpillars that each one of those genera support. And you can see that hundreds of those genera support either no caterpillars or very, very few. There's only a few genera. It's actually about 38 that are supporting most of the caterpillars that drive our food web. So these are really important plants, and I'll talk more about those later in the talk. But right now, let's try to understand why caterpillars aren't eating all plants. Why don't they, their plants are out there, why don't they take advantage of that? Well, the answer is that most caterpillars, the vast majority of them, are what we call host plant specialists. They have to eat the plants for which they have gotten around plant defenses. So for example, that's a monarch butterfly. You can put crepe myrtle in your yard. You can put boxwood. You can put buckthorn or any of the other burning bush, the things we like to put in our yards. But the monarch can't eat any of those things because it has become a specialist on one plant genus, and that is Asclepias, the milkweeds. So why? Let's develop this a little bit more. Why are insect herbivores plant specialists? Because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they protect their tissues. They put nasty chemicals in there that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And a lot of plants also have physical defenses that make them tough to eat. And it's a really effective group of defenses that protects most of the plants of the world from most of the insects of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. And if you don't believe me, after this talk, go out. I know it's night, but you can go out, grab a leaf, and eat it. See if you like it. You're not going to like it. All plants are protecting themselves. And again, most animals don't like that. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. But we do know insects eat plants. How do they do it? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Each plant lineage protects itself from a different suite of chemical defenses. So insects can't get around all those defenses. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are very similar in their chemistry, and they develop the enzymes and the behavioral adaptation, the life history adaptations that allow them to eat those plants without dying. The key is it takes them a long period of evolutionary exposure to those plants for all those adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. When we're trying to reconstruct functional ecosystems in a given space, we have to use the right plants or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when you choose the right plants. And I'm going to start with our house. We live in Oxford, Pennsylvania on 10 acres, a farm, very old farm. Had been farmed from the late 1600s on. It was broken up into 10-acre units. The ground was exhausted. Most of the topsoil was in a hollow area over here. The last bit of farming they did before they sold the property was to mow it for hay. But in our neck of the woods, mowing for hay really is mowing the rootstocks of autumn olive and multiflora rose and all the invasive plants from Asia, and you call that hay. So that's what they did before we moved in, which means most of the property looked like this. That's Cindy getting ready to get rid of Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and, again, multiflora rose and all those guys. And this is what the 10 acres looked like. If you're discouraged at your alien plant load, your invasive plant load, I don't blame you. You should be discouraged, but Cindy has proven that you can do it, and largely one person. Yeah, I helped a little bit, but she did most of it. What was I doing while she was working so hard? Well, for one thing, I was telling her that she was doing a great job, but I was also putting plants back. We couldn't just pull out all the plants and leave it bare. So I started introducing the plants that I knew supported caterpillars that I wanted to take pictures of. That's my little hobby. And one of the ones I wanted to attract was the Canadian owlet. And that's what its adult looks like, just like a leaf. But you can't have Canadian owlets unless you have meadow-rue. That is the only plant that they will develop on. And we had no meadow-rue. And there's no meadow-rue near us. I don't know where the nearest meadow-rue is, but I got some seeds from somebody and I planted meadow-rue. I'm sure it used to be here, maybe 400 years ago, but gone now. So I planted the seeds. They grew really nicely, but I thought it would be years before the Canadian owlet actually found my meadow-rue. Maybe they had to come from Canada, I don't know. So I didn't check it. It was there a month, 2 months, finally went out just to see how it was doing. It was almost defoliated by Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. So I was impressed. And now we have a booming population of meadow-rue and Canadian owlets. It was great. So there you go. I've added 2 species to our property. Here's another one, goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. Because these beautiful moths have nothing to do with goldenrod. They're actually a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. I did know where Biden's aristosa was. There was a population about 15 miles away in a power line cut, and I went and got some seeds, and they grow really, really well from seed. And it took about a year for the moth to come, but it did come, so that's 2 more species. Now we got 4 species we didn't used to have. Hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor because that's what it looks like. It's a butterfly that should be there. It's part of the fauna that should have been on our property. But of course, hackberry emperors need hackberries, and we didn't have any. So I planted hackberries. About 4 years took them, and they finally did come. And that worked so well. I went out and looked at one of my hackberries this June, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on one single branch. So we're doing well with hackberry emperors. I didn't plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and so did all the things that eat goldenrod. Things like brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of moths that eat goldenrod, by the way. This is one, the goldenrod flower moth, that has not come yet. And that's what its larvae look like. So this is anticipation. Every year I go out and I look for the goldenrod flower moth. Haven't found it yet. One of these years it's going to come, and that will be a great day. I planted Virginia creeper for the same reason. I wanted to attract particular caterpillars, like the Pandora Sphinx. How beautiful is that? And it's also equally beautiful adult. And while I was waiting for the Pandora Sphinx, although I only had to wait 1 year, other things came, like the Leonard Sphinx, the Hog Sphinx, the Abbott Sphinx, and a number of other insects eat Virginia creeper. Wanted the zebra swallowtail because I think it's our prettiest swallowtail. I like beauty as much as anybody. But it's a specialist on pawpaws. So we planted pawpaws, but this was a bit of a stretch. The nearest population that I know of zebra swallowtails is 26 miles away, 26 miles south. We're at the northern limit of zebra swallowtails in this part of the world. And I just didn't know if they would make it. Well, it took 9 years for them to find it, but they finally did. We got zebra swallowtails. While we were waiting there, we got the pawpaw sphinx. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx. And of course, lots of pawpaws. Got some pawpaws just before this talk. Walked outside and got some. We wanted the double-toothed prominent because it's a caterpillar that looks like a dinosaur, and I think that's cool. So we needed elm. I planted American elm. Now we have both of those. We wanted the evening primrose moth because it's pretty. So you needed evening primrose, and they hide in the flowers during the day. It's very, very cute. And we planted lots of oaks. Now these are just examples of what we have put on the property after Cindy got rid of our invasives. You know, a lot of people think you need a giant oak. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. Yes, so many of you have probably seen it. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's a big fella. But they think you need an oak that big before it can contribute meaningfully to your property. Not so. And so a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Yes, you will. Unless you die tomorrow, you will live long enough. And I know that because I planted my oaks as acorns. Most of them, the vast majority is acorns. Some were bare root whips that were 2 feet tall. And right away, they started to bring in the insects that develop on oaks that are really the backbone of the food web in my property. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars, of moth caterpillars, not butterflies, because I haven't gotten there yet, have come to use my oaks. And they come right away. Here's a pin oak that's just popped up above the leaves, and here's a crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the pin oak leaf. So they contribute almost immediately. This is a picture of our yard as it looks today from the same perspective I took that first picture. And look, we got a little bit of lawn here. We're very traditional. But this is to show you we put the plants back. I'm still putting plants back. And every time I put a plant lineage back, I get a new lineage of moths. And it works so well that I made it a goal to try to count all the species of moths that are using the plants in my yard. Again, I haven't gotten to caterpillars yet, just moths. And I am up to 1,012 species as of last month. Again, not done. We're still going. But 1,012 species of moth is 1,012 species of bird food. That is 39% of all of the moth species in Pennsylvania on 1/240,000th of the area of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. We're on 10 acres. So you can really crowd those species in there. And because we have so many species of bird food, we've had 59 species of birds breed on our 10 acres. And that is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that breed in Pennsylvania. Point is, it works. You know, I saw this headline last week, I guess it was, World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of the wildlife have vanished since 1970. All I can say to that is not on our property, not at our house. I can assure you we have increased the biodiversity at our house by at least 2/3, probably a lot more than that. So the message here is not how neat our house is. The message is we can reverse this. We can reverse it. Very important message. But I know what you're thinking. You're on 10 acres. What if you live in suburbia? Can it work there? Well, let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. I visited Margie and Dan just before the virus broke out. They are in a typical suburban neighborhood. They have 0.6 acres, just a little bit over half an acre. And their neighbors all have giant lawns and very, very traditional. Well, their major invasive species in Kirkwood, Missouri is bush honeysuckle. Everybody's got it. Margie and Dan Terpstra got rid of it, put in a lot of native plants and a feature they called a bubbler, little thing bubble out of a rock and then drip down. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that came to their yard. 149 bird species have used their yard so far. 35 warbler species. That's almost all the warblers in the country. Just to compare, in our house, we've only recorded 8 species of warblers at our house. So can it happen on a small place? Yes, it can. What about in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in the US. And she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive species. She put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature, and she has recorded 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock right there. Better shot of a woodcock than I've ever had at our property. The important thing about Pam is she's an island. There's no connectivity with her little 1/10 of an acre and any other natural area in that area of Chicago. She's right next to the Chicago O'Hare, one of the runways, right next to Kennedy Expressway. She really is in an urban center. Well, not a center, she's in an urban suburb, let's put it that way. But what about urban centers? Will it work there? 82% of us live in cities now. We don't want to leave all those people out. Well, in 2014, I was looking at this little bush here. This is Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed, which reminds me, we have a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. This is now Monarch's Delight. All right, 2014, I was looking at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw were 2 species of megachilid bee, of leafcutter bee. I know they're leafcutter bees because they gather their pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. And I was surprised because leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. Not only do they need pollen and nectar, they need soft leaves, like the leaves of red buds, because they cut the edges out of those leaves, roll them up, make a tube, and stuff that full of pollen. And that is where they lay their eggs. That's what they rear their young on, the pollen in those plant tubes. Well, there was redbud growing right next to Monarch's Delight. So the megachilids had exactly what they needed. Of course they were there. And because they were redbuds, there was early season blooms. I wasn't there early in the season, but I'm sure they were blooming. And that's why I saw bumblebees, because queen bumblebees have to do all the work themselves early in the season. They don't have any workers yet. They haven't made them. So they need a lot of readily available forage to get that colony going. And they obviously had it there because there were bumblebees. Then I saw monarch. Actually, saw 2 monarchs. Where were they? Well, they were on Monarch's Delight. They also were on another milkweed that was there. Now this was 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. That was the low point of the monarch population. Only 3.6% left compared to 1976. And this was June of 2014. It's very early for us to see monarchs up this far north on the East Coast in June. So I saw 2. I was pleasantly surprised. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. Here we go. This is the nature I was around. 30 feet above pavement with zooming cars. Several million people visit the High Line every year. It is a top tourist destination. And here's the strip of nature we're talking about. There's Monarch's Delight. This is Rick Darke. He was after me to visit the High Line for years, tell me how neat it was. And I'm not much of a city boy. So I wasn't anxious to do it, but we finally did go, and I thought I'd see a lot of pretty plants, but nothing on those plants. But I was wrong. You know, somebody studied the bees on the High Line. So far, they found 30 species of bees on this little strip here. So you know, if we can bring life to the middle of Manhattan with just tiny strips of thoughtful native plantings, and not all the plants are native either, then we can do it almost anywhere. This is a real message of hope here. But there are four things we need to consider if we're going to succeed. And the first one is we've got to shrink the lawn. We have way too much lawn in this country, about 40 million acres. That's the size of New England. That is a deadscape like this. There's very little difference between this lawn and the moon in terms of its ability to support life. So I'm suggesting that we cut this area in half. The lawn we keep can still be a status symbol. We can still be high quality citizens. Our neighbors will still love us, but we're going to have plants in the other part of the lawn. And if we do that in half the area that is in lawn, that'll give us 20 million acres to work with. And if we do it at home, we can create what I'm going to call homegrown national park. And it will be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, plus Sequoia National Park, Grand Canyon, Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. We will make the biggest national park in the country. And there'll be a lot of benefits to building this park at home. The biggest one is it going to allow us to reconnect with nature with very little effort. And it'll be the connection for the first time for an awful lot of people who have never had a connection with nature. They can establish a relationship with the natural world at their own pace, their own time. Avoiding crowds, they don't have to pay, it's free. Doesn't matter how many pandemics come down the road, it's never going to be closed. No travel hassles. And they get to experience the natural world alone. I don't know how you develop that personal relationship with other people. You need to be alone to interact with the natural world without no parents around if you're kids. You know, we're worried about kids having nature deficit disorder. And Richard Lewis says, we got to get them out in nature. So, you know, we put them on a bus, 30 kids on a bus with a teacher. They go to a natural area, they walk around for an hour, and then they go home. And the teacher tells them not to touch anything. So what have they experienced? They've experienced 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. Yes, it's better than nothing. But what they need is that alone time in the natural world so they can develop a relationship. They need to learn how to hunt lizards. And I'm learning this from my granddaughter, Zoe. And this is how you hunt lizards. First of all, she lives in Hawaii, and her patch of nature is pretty small. It's about 10 by 10 feet. There it is, lawn and a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. So this is how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you crawl very slowly, but first you have to disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. You have to be serious, no smiling. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. And then you sneak up on the lizards. Now, I don't really expect Zoe to hunt lizards like this the rest of her life, but I can guarantee you she's going to remember the fun time she had hunting lizards in Hawaii for the rest of her life. If you want to do more than hunt lizards, get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranisti, is filled with ideas of what kids can do in natural areas right near your home. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. What are we going to put in the areas we take out of lawn? We've got to put the plants that are supporting most of the life. Now, I alluded to this earlier. It's one of the most important things we've discovered in my lab at the University of Delaware. And that is that not all native plants are supporting life equally. Only about 5% of them are making about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives our food webs. 14% of them are making 90% of the caterpillar food, which means there's a lot of native plants out there not doing a whole lot. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can construct a 100% native landscape that supports almost nothing if I choose those plants that are so well protected nothing can eat them. So the question really is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our landscape, or benign plants that aren't doing anything, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants, all those invasive species from Asia that we have brought to our shores. I get an email once or twice a year from somebody reminding me that ginkgo biloba, they said, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia is actually a North American plant? It grew in North America 7 million years ago. And the person would say, that means they're native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. This is not our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native anymore. It's how productive they are. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. They're not invasive, but they're benign. They're taking up space and not contributing to our local food webs. What is contributing the most? Well, oaks do in 84% of the counties of North America. 557 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic states, and that includes New York, are on eating oaks, and 900 species of caterpillars, 900 species of bird food produced by oaks nationwide. Here's an example of how important keystone oaks are in a landscape. And let's use mine as an example. Remember, I've taken pictures of 1,012 species of moss. Out of those species, 888 of them have known host plants. So we've got over 100 species that we don't know what they eat. Out of the 888, 262 species use oaks. Now we have 59 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is Quercus, the genus of oaks. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. Yet they're supporting almost 30% of our moss species. So if I took oaks out of my property, think what would it do, not just to the diversity of the moths that are there, but to the diversity of the birds that are eating all those moths and so many other things. That's the power of a keystone plant. How do you find what your keystone species are? You go to Native Plant Finder, the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants best at supporting the caterpillars in your county will pop up. This is what a typical list looks like, the highest ranking plants, and they go way down, but I ran out of room. And notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native maples. That's because it is very easy to go to the nursery and buy a non-native oak or a non-native cherry. Weeping willow is from the Middle East. A lot of maples that are sold in nurseries that are non-native. They are members of native genera. But when we bring these species to our yard, we lose 68% of the caterpillars that would normally be on those species if we bought native members. So ask, don't just say I want an oak, ask, make sure it's a native oak. These are the top producing herbaceous plants: goldenrods, asters, helianthus, and these are also the top producing or the plants that support the most specialized bees. With these three genera in your yard, you can have almost 40 species of bees that won't be there unless you have goldenrods, asters, and sunflowers. So those are, again, the power of these keystone plants in your yard. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in the keystone plants, bring lots of insects to our yard. Then we're going to kill them with our security lights at night. Well, we don't want to do that. But research is showing, particularly research from Europe, that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines wherever we have lights. You know, after 100 years of wondering why moths are attracted to lights at night, we still don't know. But we do know that they can die from exhaustion. They can die by colliding with the light and getting incinerated. They can die from dehydration. They can die when the bat comes and eats them. It blinds, these lights blind night insects, nocturnal insects. Who knew? We didn't know that. And it ruins a lot of their daily activities. So again, major cause of insect declines is light pollution. And for me, that is really good news because it is so easily corrected. Just turn your lights out. At least during the peak of the season, I would say from April through the end of September. If we did that, well, first of all, I know what you're going to say. I can't turn my light out because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light because then it will only turn on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to learn is how often the bad man does not come. If you don't want to do that, take out the white bulb. Mercury vapor bulbs are the very worst. Take them out and replace it with a yellow bulb, which is going to throw yellow wavelengths. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than our white wavelengths. And yellow LED lights are the least attractive. If we replaced our night lights with yellow LED lights, overnight we could save billions of insects and lots of energy. Fourth thing we need to do is landscape in a way that allows the caterpillars we attract to our yard to complete their development. If they don't complete their development, that's the end of the caterpillars. This is what I mean by that. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, can complete their development on the oak tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branches, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish everything did that, but most species don't. 94%, 480 species drop from the tree, wiggle their way underground, pupate underground in a little chamber, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And you know where I'm going here. We don't have any leaf litter under our trees. We make sure that it is, got to get rid of that litter. And the soil is mowed, or the ground is mowed and compacted, and typically way too hard for caterpillar to tunnel in there. So this becomes an ecological trap. If these were all oaks or high producing trees, the moths would fly in, lay their eggs, the caterpillars would develop, and then they drop down and then they die. And the next year, the next generation, they'd be far smaller. And I'm pretty sure, I'm almost certain that this is one of the major causes of insect declines, along with that light pollution. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. And I'm not trying to discourage trees in cities. They're a great idea for cities, but I am trying to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. This is just laziness, and it ruins our watersheds. We know this. This is what most people do. You got a big line, you stick a tree in the middle. Nobody has measured how well the caterpillars do in a situation like this, but I know they're going to do better in a situation like this, where you've got a tree and a layered landscape. Here's a native azalea. You could have a dogwood over here, or an ironwood, ferns and ground cover. The caterpillar drops down. The ground is loose. They can easily get underground. Nobody's going to step on them. Nobody's going to mow them. This is a safe site. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You have a tree and then build a bed around that tree. Make it a big bed. And now it's not grass anymore. You're not wounding the tree with your lawnmower. And you've created a safe site for those caterpillars. This is where you can put in your ground covers like wild ginger or May apples or foam flower or countless others. More good news. There is room for compromise in our plant choices. And this comes from research from another PhD student, Desiree Narango, who studied chickadees, Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. In typical suburban landscapes, she put up nest boxes and she compared landscapes that were dominated by native plants with landscapes that were dominated by introduced plants in terms of their ability to support chickadee populations. And the first thing she found is that landscapes dominated by introduced plants, by non-native ornamentals, produce 75% fewer caterpillars than the landscapes dominated by native plants. So right away, they reduce the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. The chickadees would come, look at the nest box, but they'd also look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to reproduce. If they did try, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. If they did survive, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed by 1.5 days. So you might say, well, those aren't huge differences. They are pretty big differences. But if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native plant biomass in your yard, from no non-native plants to 100% non-native plants, this is what you get. This is the dotted line. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die each year. If the population makes this many babies, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If they make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if they make fewer, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap. So what that means is as soon as you exceed 30% of your plant biomass as non-native plants, you get up in here 50, 75% non-native plants, you're way down here in the danger zone. You're not going to be able to support breeding birds for very long. So I love this study for two reasons. First of all, it's the first bird species anywhere that where we have tied the health of the bird to the plants that are in the landscape. First time this has been done anywhere for any species. So anybody who's wondering really whether your plant choice is going to impact anything else, take a good look at this study and you'll be convinced that it will. But I'm also excited because this is the area of compromise. Remember, you can have up to 30% non-native plant biomass. So you can have your ginkgo, you can have your boxwood, no invasive plants, no Japanese knotweed or anything, because that just causes huge problems outside of your property. But those other ones, as long as it's less than 30% of the total plant biomass, you can still have functional ecosystem services in the form of producing bird populations. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Somebody sent me this picture and I was very poor at I didn't figure out who that person was. I've lost the email, but it's the land manager of this formal landscape. And what he's doing is sneaking in native plants. And his goal is to replace all these plants with native plants just to show that you can do it. And he's not telling anybody. So he's got Joe Pye in there. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It's just Joe Pye. And he's going to replace the rest of the plants with native plants. And he can do that because formality is not a function of the plants in the design. It's a function of the design itself. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants there. Can we get a pollinator garden into this typical suburban yet fairly formal landscape without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. All of a sudden it's acceptable. It's got lots of species in there. It's not very big. Of course, the bigger it is, the better. But if everybody had little pollinator gardens like this, little pocket prairies, the fate of our native bee populations would be much more secure. Make it a little bigger. These are Drew Latham designs, by the way. Imagine the amount of life here versus the amount of life here. Enough said. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can, and there are more and more programs around the country that are doing this. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program that's encouraging homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate prairie plantings. The state helps pay for that. Florida, there are places in Florida that are paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in their front yards. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. You get paid if you're taking care of an endangered species. Everybody would want one then. They wouldn't be killing them, so nobody would tell them they couldn't do something with their property. Missouri had a bounty on calorie pears, on Bradford pears. If you bred in a Bradford pear body, you got a free tree. San Antonio water system, a public utility, gives homeowners $100 coupons to start planting plants that are water efficient natives. And there's lots of lawn replacement programs, particularly in California. They're taking the thirsty lawn out of there and putting in appropriate xeric plantings. We've made at least 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one, I think, is that we have assumed that nature is important, but not essential. Which means when push comes to shove, we worry about other things first, and then nature takes a back seat. You know, we're coming up on an election, as you certainly know. Tonight, watch the debate and tell me whether biodiversity is talked about at all. It won't be one of the top 10 things that people worry about. Not that they don't care. They just, it's just not important, they don't think. I went to Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there that I think reflects our cultural view of nature. I've heard top conservation biologists talk this way. We need to save nature for future generations. We want our kids in the future to be able to appreciate the marvels of the natural world. But to me, that makes nature just entertainment. Not essential, but entertainment. I think we need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. Second misstep, we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this. By restricting conservation areas just to places where there aren't a lot of humans, they're destined to fail because those areas will be too small and too isolated from each other to be able to sustain the species we need. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments. None of them are acting like a Persian rug. And then, of course, in between is what we've done to our ecosystems. And in between these little habitat fragments is no man's land. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, even our yards, even our corporate landscapes, every place. So what we need to do is put the plants back in those no-man lands. This, of course, is what pollinator pathways are doing. We're putting the plants back, creating connectiveness between the habitat islands that still exist. But we want to do it so well that it's not just biological corridors, that it's places where people can, where nature can actually thrive. They can live there, not just pass back and forth. We've got to glue our ecosystems together, and we now know how to do it. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few scientists, a few ecologists, conservation biologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every single human being on the planet. And I have no idea why, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? Can't imagine. Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, says that the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. It's not just the settlers that had this mindset. That is our mindset today. We have rights. Okay, we have rights, but we also have those obligations. We're not born with these mindsets. We're taught them. We need to focus on this one a little bit more than we have. We have an obligation to keep the Earth a living place. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, right now, so many of us feel powerless in trying to address the enormous problems that face the planet right now. But you can go out in your yard, you can plant an acorn tomorrow, you can plant any one of those powerhouse plants, put in a pollinator garden, do something, reduce your lawn, get rid of an invasive plant in your yard, and you have become an important cog in the future wheel of conservation. You are making a difference, and you can go out and measure it after you do that. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. They are too big. You'll get depressed. Just think about your little piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, do the 4 things we talked about. Shrink the lawn, put in a pollinator garden, get rid of the invasive plants. We didn't say a lot about that, but you know that's what you have to do. And plant those keystone plants. Oh, you can turn the lights out too. That'll be good. And if you don't own property, you can volunteer in the nearest park or preserve. Because all the parks and preserves are underfunded and understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power. We certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and, of course, our fate ultimately. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm done.
Wow, I'm just digesting. Thank you very much, Doug.
Digesting dinner?
Digesting the dinner of all you have shared with us.
Okay, good.
All right. Let me see. I have some advanced questions that were sent to me. Let me also see if we have any questions and answers in the box. Yes, we do. Okay, so I'm going to start with the advanced questions. How is it best to get the message about the benefit of native plants into a wider community? Homeowners and small conservation groups can have a positive impact, but it is very frustrating when nurseries, municipalities, and big groups like Arbor Day Foundation continue to plant non-native trees. This is a question from Pat.
It's a good question. Of course, I've been working on that for the last 15 years, trying to find out what works best. That's why I write the books. That's why I give these webinars. It's why when you do this successfully at home, that is now an advertisement, and people can walk by and say, hey, I like that. That works. I've often thought of having a bring your neighbor night, somebody who would never ever come to a webinar like this. Use all your social capital and make them sit there and listen. But we've been thinking, how do you reach the non-choir is the real question. If you look at the membership of the National Wildlife Federation, the vast majority of members are women who are 65 or older. So that's, that's a good group, but we've got to hit the other people as well. We could turn this around overnight if we change the tax structure where you address things people do care about, which is money. And they would do anything the tax structure told them to do with their yard, shrink the lawn, plant more natives, if there was a financial benefit to it. It doesn't have to be much, but Costa Rica proved this years ago. Now the top industry in Costa Rica, or at least before the virus, it was ecotourism. Well, they had taken a country that was 80% forested and made it 40% forested by just logging everything outside the parks. And it really threatened the ecotourism. So they started giving people a tax break to plant the trees back on their properties, saved the coral reefs that were all silted over. And it started to work immediately to reverse that. They're now somewhere up in the 50% again as the people put plants back and get just not much, but it's a little bit of a tax break. And that, that creates social momentum. It says this is favored by the state. You're not going to be the neighborhood pariah anymore. You're doing what is best for everybody, and you're getting recognition for it. So that would go a long way. First of all, don't be depressed, because I have watched changes. I had a big long session with the National Arbor Day people. They sent me the list of plants that they offer, and they said, which one should we not offer anymore? And I put big checks next to an awful lot of them, sent it to them, and they haven't spoken to me since. But maybe they're going to listen to that. I don't know. I talk to nurserymen all the time. I do see it changing. The nursery industry is a business. They just want to sell plants. If you want them to sell native plants, that's what you should ask for. And they are recognizing that there's a market there. Somebody told me from Michigan the other day, when Bringing Nature Home came out in 2007, there were no native plant nurseries in northern Michigan, 0. Today, just around the Traverse City area, there are 6. So it's increasing, and that market is hard to keep up with now. People can't find the plants. So I see all these changes, and I think we are getting the message out. It's hard to change the culture, but I think it is happening.
Beautiful. The question that's very similar that Pat asks is support growing in the academic community for the importance of native plants to ecosystem health?
Support in the academic community. Support in academia is measured by grant money. And grant money typically comes from National Science Foundation or USDA. So no, neither one of those is supporting this, because both of those agencies support what they call novel research, something nobody's thought of before. They did. National Science Foundation gave me 2 grants to work on this, big grants, and it was great. That chickadee study, that was NSF funded. But we've done that now, and it's pretty well, the rules of the game are well outlined. So it's not novel anymore. They want to fund the next new idea. It's not that it's not important, but they don't just give you a grant to do something. It's got to be something nobody else has ever done before. So, we're looking for other funding agencies, or I think private funding is so powerful. There's a lot of money out there, and a lot of people don't know what to do with it. So if anybody has a lot of money and doesn't know what to do with it, University of Delaware, Doug Tallamy, remember that.
Oh, thank you. Pat, Georgia asks, it is difficult to find native plants at our local nurseries, and if they do carry them at all, they are often hybrids or cultivars instead of the straight species. We know we can get native plants from such places as Prairie Moon Nursery, but prefer to support our local businesses. What should we do?
Well, again, it's market driven. You have to convince your local nurserymen that there is a market there. They don't care which plant they carry. They do want to sell it. They don't want to carry inventory that's not going to sell. So you as the market have to convince your local growers that that's what you want to plant. How do you do that? You go to the nursery and you say, I want to buy hydrangea arborescens, straight species, not Annabelle. They'll say, well, we only carry Annabelle. You say, well, okay, goodbye. And if enough people say that, he'll say, well, maybe I ought to get the straight species. It's, just demonstrating. But remember, we have treated plants just as if they were decorations for more than a century. The horticultural trade still doesn't believe that you don't want, or that you believe plants are more than decorations now. So they want to carry the prettiest plants because so many people just buy for aesthetics. We've got to convince them that yes, we want pretty plants, but we want functional plants too. And again, it is happening. I know some native plant guys. There's a guy, Merv Wallace in St. Louis. He showed me a graph of his sales. It looks like the human population growth rate. It's straight up, and he can't keep up with it. So people are catching on, and they'll catch up in your area too if they realize there's a market there.
Right. Dell asks, how do we increase the biodiversity of our insects and as well our local food gardens, both of them?
How do we
increase the biodiversity of our insects?
Yeah.
And also have our local food gardens. In other words, it's not.
Oh, okay. So I see.
Their plants.
All right. So if you have a lot of insects, you can't have a garden. Okay. It's actually just the opposite of that. I don't want to discourage home gardening because that's locally grown food. And I mean, there's nothing better than that. But that is a different goal from planting, natives for insects. So take the land you're going to use for your garden and you plant your garden. But if you have a diverse native planting around that garden, what you're going to have is a lot more natural enemies that will help control the insect pests you do have on your garden. Most of the insects that attack gardens are non-native insects, things like the cabbage white butterfly. That's, major problem. It's over here without its natural enemies. So we have to supply a lot of generalist parasitoids and predators that will help control that insect. The tomato hornworm, tobacco hornworm that gets on our tomatoes. What do you do about that? Have you ever seen the white cocoons on its back? People think they're white insect eggs, but those are the cocoons of a braconid wasp that have already tunneled out the inside of that caterpillar. Those wasps are specialists on sphinx moths, but they attack a lot of sphinx moths. So at my house, we have 17 species of sphinx moths. Actually, we added the Abbott sphinx, so now we have 18 species of sphinx moths. When we get the tobacco hornworm, which is not often, there's a huge How about that? Am I back?
You're back.
Okay, I'm sorry. I hit a stupid button. Okay, because we got so many species of sphinx moths on the native plants around us, they're harboring a big population of the parasitoids that hit the tobacco hornworm. So that's a natural enemy complex that wouldn't be there if I didn't have other native plants to support the other species of sphinx moths. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all those white moths that were so harmful in my garden this year. Gail asks, how important to insects, birds, wildlife was the American chestnut? And what benefits would you expect to see when it is restored to our eastern forests? It has been a missing link for 100 years, but now there is hope for its restoration.
Right. How important? Enormously important. It's, you know, it's in the Fagaceae, the plant family that the oaks are in, so closely related to oaks. Oaks are the most powerful plant we can put in our ecosystems today, but nobody really knows exactly how powerful chestnuts were in terms of producing insects. We do know there's at least 8 moth species that went extinct with the chestnut. I know it's not extinct, there's still some there, but there's so few there that most of those moths are gone at this point. And that might not sound like very much, but you know, this was at the turn of the century, and there just weren't that many good insect collections at that time. The chestnuts themselves that were produced were, you know, that was the top mast food that fed our vertebrates, our deer, our bear, our turkeys, all of those big vertebrates. And if it wasn't for oaks that were around making acorns and compensating for the loss of chestnuts, we would have lost a lot more animal species than we did. So putting the plants back, putting the chestnut back, will be a tremendous advantage for our local ecosystems. I've got a few chestnuts on my property. The biggest one now, it's made chestnuts a few years now, and it's got the canker. It's going to die. But it was fun to watch the squirrels and other things when all of a sudden there were chestnuts on the ground, and you're right, they haven't been there for 100 years, but boy, did they love them when they were there. So it'll be a great day when we put the chestnut back.
John asks, what is it about native plants as opposed to non-native that makes them so much better to support the food chain?
Well, that was that discussion about plant defenses. They're better because our insects are adapted to them. They have the ability to eat those plants without dying, but they can't eat burning bush or Japanese knotweed or buckthorn or you know, the non-native plants that we've brought here, because they haven't been able to adapt to the chemical defenses in those plants. So they don't even recognize them as plants. They're just things that are out there, and the insects that drive these food webs are looking for the plants that support them. So it's not that burning bush is an evil plant, it's that the monarch can't eat it and nothing else can eat it. So if you take all the understory out of your forest and replace it with burning bush, and that's what an invasive plant does, or bush honeysuckle, or any of the other things that we've done, you're knocking all of that insect food out of the food web.
Got it. John also asks, is it a bad idea to use bird feeders filled with store-bought birdseed?
No, it's a good idea. Studies have shown that birds that are fed through the winter with birdseed enter the breeding season heavier, and they lay more eggs. In other words, they're healthier. I have heard ornithologists say you don't have to feed the birds, they can feed themselves, because they always have. And in a healthy ecosystem, that's correct. But and maybe, you know, you live in upper New York State, you've got a lot more habitat than we do. But down here, you know, you got the big lawns in the houses, and the big lawns in the houses, there are no meadows here making the seed for those birds. So the population of wintering birds would be far smaller if we didn't feed birds in an awful lot of places. Now you have to do it responsibly. Don't crowd your bird feeders so that they can give each other diseases. Don't let your seed get rancid by leaving it in there for, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks. I don't feed the birds during the summer when there's so many insects around to support them, and it's hard to keep the seed from going rancid during the summer. But feeding them is a good idea because it supplements what we've taken away with our crazy landscapes.
Great. Gail asks, here in the Hudson Valley, we have widespread overbrowsing by deer, which leaves forest deserts. How can a homeowner best deal with this in a cost-effective way so we can be successful planting native plants?
Well, that is a major issue pretty much all over the country now. As you move further west, it becomes an issue with mule deer and I guess mostly mule deer, but white-tailed deer are everywhere. When we moved into our property in Chester County, there were areas of Chester County that had 140 deer per square mile, which is 14 times over the carrying capacity for deer. So how did I deal with that? Well, we had 10 acres. I did not want to fence the 10 acres. And some deer as a natural component of our forests. So, you know, we've got to reduce the deer population. That's a different subject, but that is the ultimate solution, is to have fewer deer. But until we do that, what I did was put wire cages around the plants that I didn't want the deer to eat, which is almost all of them. There are a few plants that deer won't there's no plant that a starving deer won't eat, but they don't like spice bush. They don't like goldenrod. There are some things you don't need to protect, but that baby oak tree, they'll eat it in a second. So I put a wire cage. You get 5-foot galvanized wire, and I didn't scrimp, not skinny like this, so it can't spread out its branches. Put a wide cage around it, and they grow rapidly and get to the point in not too many years where you can take the cage off. I call that graduation. It's always a nice day. But I've got that cage now. So I'm still using the same cages that I created when we moved in 20 years ago as I move them around from one plant to the other. It's, you know, it's labor. They're ugly while they're there, but I've got a thriving ecosystem now because I have kept the deer off.
Do you have a book with all the photos of your land?
No. Well,
oh, darn, we need to see
I've got a book with the photos of the things on my land.
Oh, okay.
But
well, Betsy wanted to know if you have a recommendation for a good caterpillar field guide.
Yes. David L. Wagner's Caterpillars of Eastern North America would be one. And he also has a book called The Owlets, which he let go out of print. I want to slap him upside the head, but you can still get it on Amazon for over $200. So it used to be a good thing. But if you can get it in your library, the owlets, it's all about the noctuid moths. That's the biggest family of moths. And it's very, very handy. What he's done is allow non-entomologists, allow the public to have access to the caterpillars that they're finding. There's nothing worse than finding something and not knowing what it is. When you can put a name on it and read what it eats and when it appears and everything, then it becomes your friend. You get to know it. And that's what his books have done. So start with the Caterpillars of Eastern North America. It's a great place to start.
Okay, great. Well, at this time, I'm going to have to end the question and answer session and just thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and thank you everyone for joining tonight. It's important to know our pollinator pathway website, which is mentioned in the chat box if you want to copy that real quick before we end. Woodstock NY pollinatorpathway.org. There you can join our pollinator pathway, which means that you will be adding your meadow garden, your pollinator pathway garden. And you can also sign up for our newsletter. There's also information about how you can get your yard sign and certainly how you could donate if you care to do so. This talk will be recorded and it will be on the Pollinator Pathway website probably sometime tomorrow. So again, thank you everyone. Thanks for all the hard work that everyone put into making this possible. And any last words for us, Doug? We have time for a last message.
You all are nature's best hope. That's all I have to say. I'll also say vote early and vote often.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.